Happy 2026, it's Jason, long time no see. 2025 felt like a down year. My level of enthusiasm reading-wise just wasn't there, and I think one of the main issues is that I'm starting to get series fatigue. I'm still trying to catch up on the Wheel of Times, the Malazans, and I haven't even started on the Stormlight Archives, among others. The pressure of all that just makes reading less enjoyable, and I'd really like to move on to some other books outside of fantasy and sci-fi, like classic literature and nonfiction. Now, when I go and look back at what I read in 2025, come to find out I actually read more than all my previous years. I also read a higher number of 800 plus page novels and squeezed in some manga. I got on the One Piece train and I had a really great time with it, so I guess it wasn't a bad reading year after all. On the channel side, I really struggled to find energy and time to put out more content. Making these videos isn't easy, and at the moment I don't have a good ecosystem to push out more videos on a consistent basis. I'm actually contemplating on incorporating other forms of content like music and movie reviews to attract more viewers, in the hope that I can lead them to read more books. My goal with this channel was to use social media to get people off of social media. We currently live in a society full of ignorance and people who lack empathy, and reading helps people look outside of themselves and develop that empathy, along with some much needed critical thinking. So yeah, I have much to think about and plan in a new year. Enough of my rambling, here are my top 10 reads of 2025. At number 10 is the last book I read in 2025. It's also a book I swore I wouldn't read unless I knew the series was complete. And to no surprise, that book is A Game of Thrones by George R.R. Martin. The reason why I caved in was because I was looking for a good winter-themed book to read during the holiday season, and I couldn't think of anything more perfect to enhance my reading experience. Now, the reason why it's number 10 on the list is because it was just missing the shock value of coming into the series not knowing what to expect. Watching the first season years ago kind of ruins the shock value, and being that this series is so ingrained in our culture, it's almost impossible to avoid spoilers. Even with that, I really enjoyed this read, and Tyrion Lannister just might be my favorite character out of everything I read. Personality-wise, it's like having a Tony Stark in Game of Thrones, even though his last name is Lannister. At number 9, I was torn between The Dead Zone and Uzumaki, but chose Dead Zone because the pacing was much tighter. It's also one of Stephen King's most underrated novels. The Dead Zone is one of the first books where Stephen King steps out of his horror comfort zone early in his career. It's a psychological thriller that had me fully engaged from start to finish. For a story written in 1979, some of the parallels to our current political landscape are hard to miss. I think I reached a point where I find myself enjoying his non-horror work more than some of his most popular and iconic crowd pleasers. For number 8, I chose to keep things in the family with the long-awaited return of Joe Hill. King Sorrow is his newest novel after a 9-year hiatus. This novel felt sort of like a post-high school Stranger Things, with characters around the Steve Harrington and Nancy Wheeler age group. It also starts off in the late 80s into the 90s and through the early 2000s, where real-life current events serve as a backdrop. The main antagonist is an evil dragon named King Sorrow, who's pretty much an asshole version of Pete's dragon. After the first half of the book, I strongly felt like this was on track to be my read of the year. Unfortunately, I felt a little less engaged when we head into the 2000s, with some unexpected turns in the character arcs that I have some mixed feelings on. But those are just minor nitpicks because this 800 plus page chonker is a massive event, in the same vein as Stan and It, and I was happy to be able to experience something like this on first release. At number 7, Buffalo Hunter Hunter by Stephen Graham Jones really caught me off guard, mainly because I wasn't sure what to think after reading the novel. I basically had a neutral first reaction, as I neither liked or disliked the book, but the story managed to linger in the back of my mind and I couldn't stop thinking about it for weeks. I watched the movie Sinners about a month later, and the film gave off similar vibes to the book. Both are works of historical fiction featuring vampires, with the novel focusing on the Native American experience. I eventually grew to have a better appreciation of the novel, and I now think it's one of the best vampire books ever written. Weird how that worked out. At number 6, I have The Chronicles of Doom by S.H. Fernando. As a hip-hop fan, the late, great MF Doom is easily one of my top 2 favorite rappers of all time. Him and Nas are in a frequent battle over that number 1 spot. And the day I walked into my local Barnes & Nobles and saw the Chronicles of Doom book sitting on the shelf with the dopest cover art I've ever seen, my head nearly exploded. That alone might have put this on my top 10, but thankfully the content of this biography was just as good. The book covers nearly every major aspect of his life and music career, from his time in the hip-hop group KMD, his evolution into the Doom villain persona, and his album collaborations with Madlib, JJ Doom, and even the Cartoon Network. What I love most about this biography is that it really takes a deep dive into his creative process and showcases how much of a unique and brilliant mind he was. If you're a fan of MF Doom, this is a must-read. If you're late to the party, this is a perfect introduction. At number 5, I have The Howling Dark. 2025 was the year I dove into Christopher Ruocchio's Sun Eater series. I read 2 books starting with The Empire of Silence, which I thought was a decent start, but it didn't quite sell me due to pacing issues and not quite being the sprawling space opera I was expecting. The Howling Dark, on the other hand, fixed all those issues with an intense, fast-paced cyberpunk page-turner that really opened up the universe and made it feel vast. The Howling Dark is often hailed as the most popular installment in the Sun Eater series, and I can see why. I just hope the series doesn't peak for me here. Number 4, Hyperion by Dan Simmons. Hyperion and Dune are often a topic of debate over which is the best sci-fi novel of all time, and with Dune being my personal favorite sci-fi book, I figured I'd go ahead and take that Coke and Pepsi challenge. The individual tales of 6 pilgrims traveling to the world of Hyperion, where they encounter a mysterious creature called the Shrike, really captured my imagination. The episodic structure of the story in some ways made it feel like it was Pulp Fiction in space, and while it didn't quite top Dune at being my favorite sci-fi novel, I gotta say that this work of literature is an absolute masterpiece and deserves its place on anyone's mantle. So after a 2-year hiatus, I returned to the world of Malazan. I read the trio of the House of Chains, Midnight Tides, and the Bone Hunters, with House of Chains being my least favorite of the 3, although sections featuring Carcel Orlong are among my favorites in the series. I was torn between Midnight Tides and Bone Hunters, as I thought they were both excellent. But for the number 3 spot, Midnight Tides edged out Bone Hunters, simply because it's the only book I've read that made me physically laugh out loud, which is an amazing feat for Steven Erikson, because this happens to also be one of the darkest books I've read. And we all know how great of a writer he is, but I feel like the way he handles humor is severely underrated. What's crazy is none of it feels forced or out of place. His comic timing is brilliant. As for the rest of the novel, it's top tier Malazan. Memories of Ice was my favorite of the series, and I placed this installment right up there along with Bone Hunters. For the number 2 spot, the honor goes to The Forgetting Moon by Brian Lee Durfee. This also happens to be the second to the last book I read in 2025. Brian Lee Durfee happens to be my favorite booktuber, and he actually inspired me to create my own YouTube channel. He often mentions how authors like George R.R. Martin, Stephen King, and Ted Williams were his main inspirations for wanting to be a writer, and after reading this book, you can tell that he proudly wears that on his sleeve. And it's those influences that made The Forgetting Moon such an unforgettable reading experience. The pacing and character work in this novel are immaculate. Durfee wastes no time cutting to the chase. The story just keeps moving forward, and not once did I find myself counting how many pages were left in a chapter. The structure and grimdark nature of this book share a lot of similarities with Game of Thrones, and while the characters aren't as iconic, I enjoyed this book a lot more, and I can take solace in knowing that the series is actually completed. I'm not going to say much else because I'd like to reserve my thoughts for a whole separate video that I'm planning. Job well done, Brian, and thank you for ending a really shitty 2025 on a high note. And my number 1 read of 2025 goes to the 3rd and final book in the Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn trilogy, and that is To Green Angel Tower by Tad Williams. I'm just going to cut to the chase and say that this is the best fantasy novel I have ever read. In at 520,000 words, it's one of, if not, the largest book I've experienced, nearly the same length as the 2 previous installments combined, and I enjoyed every minute, every second, and word of this masterpiece. My prior favorite fantasy novel was The Dragonbone Chair, and The Green Angel Tower has everything that book had and then some. Volume 2, The Stone of Farewell, didn't quite reach those heights for me. It's more of a bridge novel that goes from point A and never really quite gets to point B. But it's all worth it because it sets up all the story arcs and subplots for the ultimate payoff in the finale. I hardly get emotional when it comes to reading books, but The Green Angel Tower had me feeling some teardrops. These characters felt like they were a part of my life. Ted Williams' level of intricate world building is nearly on the same level as The Lord of the Rings, and it's this series that directly inspired George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire. And if you read Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn prior to Game of Thrones, you'll spot little homages here and there. He is indeed your favorite fantasy author's favorite author. I like to say that Ted Williams is to the fantasy genre what MF Doom is to hip hop. Often appreciated but always underrated. And those were my top 10 reads of 2025. What was your top 10? Perhaps some of these books will end up on your list for 2026. And that's all I have for today. Stay grounded, stay safe, and I'll catch you guys on the next page.